Okay, so here we go with the actual close reading work. So I note that right away we open with this really kind of bold and very forceful assertion. The time has arrived in the history of the Great Republic. Okay, so that opening is very bold, very forceful, very assertive. It's a very eye-opening kind of introduction. It brooks no discussion or argument, so a very powerful kind of opening. In the history of the Great Republic, when we may again give evidence to the world of the bravery and patriotism of a race in whose hearts burns the love of country, of freedom, and of civil and religious toleration. Okay, so a couple things I noticed. First off, we refer to America as the Great Republic rather than calling it the United States. And the connotation there is one of something very grand and special and powerful. You know, it's not just a country, it's kind of this big idea. The idea of a republic, a government that's, really a representative government, which has never really been seen before. And then I also note here that there's this listing of all these quintessential American values. Okay, talking about how we are a people in whose hearts burn these things. So by making reference to these things, he's already kind of like forcing the reader, or the audience in this case, to see that the upcoming message is tied to these essential American qualities. It is these grand principles that enable men, however proscribed when possessed of true patriotism, to say, "My country, right or wrong, I love thee still." Okay, so again, he calls these grand principles. So he's impressing upon his audience that these are really important qualities, things worth fighting for. These are the things that are quintessential to our being. And if we're going to be fighting this huge war, then, well, these are the qualities that we need to fight to protect or preserve. And then here, I really like this too. This is an interesting thing to do. "My country, right or wrong, I love thee still." I think this is an interesting choice to make considering his audience, because we're talking, a group of folks who, again, have likely lived a difficult life, who have not really experienced the, sweetness of the American dream the way that their more fortunate white counterparts have. And so when he says that, he loves his country right or wrong, this kind of inspires, or is working to inspire, the same kind of acknowledgement from his audience that, okay, America is not a perfect place, but it's still a place worth fighting for. Okay, moving on. He's going to continue in that vein here. "It is true, the brave deeds of our fathers, sworn and subscribed to by the immortal Washington of the Revolution of 1776, and by Jackson and others in the War of 1812, have failed to bring us into recognition as citizens, enjoying those rights so dearly bought by those noble and patriotic sires." Okay, so, first off, he's saying it is true. Like, when he begins that way, he is essentially acknowledging that there are limitations, or acknowledging that, hey, things are not perfect in America, especially for people of our color. It is true that even though our forebears have fought so hard to bring freedom, then things are not entirely right. Okay, they have failed to bring us into recognition as citizens, us as in blacks. A couple of other things that I notice here besides him just qualifying, which is good for building ethos, I notice that he's referencing these very kind of hallowed, sacred, historical events. Okay, even though, the time of the Civil War was not that far removed from the Revolution, he's still kind of referencing back to this deed, which is almost of religious significance to people of the United States. Okay, the Revolution of 1776, the War of 1812, these epic battles of the past. It seems that he might be trying to equate what's coming to these epic struggles for freedom. He's referencing Washington as an immortal. Washington was a beloved figure of the time. It really didn't matter who you were or what color you were, but referencing him in that way is kind of provoking this sense of adoration for what he did. And then I also like this a lot here too, talking about those previous battles and the rights that were achieved after the American Revolution as rights so dearly bought. And that's an interesting choice too, because even though Greene and his fellow blacks are not enjoying, the same kind of freedom as whites are, Greene is still pointing out that the rights that exist now under the Constitution, the rights that were granted to men after the American Revolution were purchased with blood. And so by doing so, it provokes this sense of obligation from his audience. Like, wow, this America thing, we had to pay greatly for it, or at least our forebears had to, and by gosh, maybe we should be willing to do the same. Okay, moving on. He continues and acknowledges yet another failing of the United States toward blacks. It is true that our injuries in many respects are great. Fugitive slave laws, Dred Scott decisions, indictments for treason, and long and dreary months of imprisonment, the result of the most unfair rules of judicial investigation, have been the pay we have received for our solitude, sympathy, and aid, and the dangers and difficulties of those days that tried men's souls. Okay, so he's listing off, he's enumerating all these other kinds of offenses here. By pointing them out, he's demonstrating that he, as the speaker, is well aware of the grievances that his audience has. And that's kind of an ethos builder too. He's saying, hey, I'm not going to ignore the fact that our people have really, really struggled. I'm not unreasonable. I'm not so crazy as to ignore those facts. Moving on. Our duty, brethren, is not to cavil over past grievances. So, our duty, first off, let's just talk about that word choice. Provoking again a sense of obligation, a sense that this is not just a choice, but is something that we must do. He refers to his audience as his brethren. And that's an interesting choice because it connotes closeness, intimacy. Okay, he's building a sense of a bond here. He's not saying that he's above them. He's not saying that he wants them to fight and he will stay behind in safety. He's showing that he shares in the struggle with them. Is not to cavil over past grievances. So now he's starting to suggest, hey, we need to move forward. I've acknowledged that things, have not been the best for us, but let's look to the future. Let us not be derelict to duty in the time of need. While we remember the past and regret that our present position in the country is not such as to create within us that burning zeal and enthusiasm for the field of battle which inspires other men in the full enjoyment of every civil and religious emolument, yet let us endeavor to hope for the future, and improve the present auspicious moment for creating anew our claims upon the justice and honor of the Republic. And above all, let not the honor and glory achieved by our fathers be blasted or sullied by a want of true heroism among their sons. So we've got a very dense paragraph that we just read over here, but I notice a couple of things that are worth perhaps talking about. First off, I noticed that as he's encouraging them to move forward, he takes this, very strategically smart approach by saying, let us not be derelict and let us endeavor. So we've got that same kind of syntactical lead in here. Let us not do this, let us do this. And that's very different than saying, hey, just drop the past and look to the future. Okay, it's a little bit less direct and a little bit less forceful. It's more of an encouragement to move forward rather than a demand. And that's a smart move here, rhetorically speaking, because being too forceful might be counterproductive. I also noticed that the style of diction that's being used here is very, very highbrow at this point in the essay, or in the speech. And that highbrow diction kind of communicates to the audience that this subject matter is of grand and perhaps very grave importance. This is not something to speak about in slang or in informal or casual tones. This is something which needs to be spoken about in elevated tones. This is something which demands a dignified sort of discussion. And that also kind of encourages the audience here to avoid simply falling into petty bickering over, past grievances, and should we just allow ourselves to be, consumed with a sense of pettiness and a sense that, well, this is not really our fight to fight. The language there is so highbrow, so elevated, so dignified that it makes any kind of counter-argument or any response to the negative seem kind of absurd. Okay, and the last thing that I notice here is this little appeal. Let not the honor and glory achieved by our fathers be blasted or sullied by a want of true heroism among their sons. That's a really powerful kind of caution to his audience, kind of pointing out, hey, our fathers underwent so much suffering in the past. You know, regardless of the ground that we still have to make up as a race, Green is telling his fellow African Americans here, our fathers suffered more. And if we were to not fight in this moment, we would be spitting upon their sacrifices. So there's this real appeal here to their sense of duty to family. This sense that he's, making them feel embarrassed or at the thought of letting their fathers and their forebears down. Okay, let's move into the last little part of the speech here. Let us then take up the sword, trusting in God, who will defend the right, remembering that these are other days than those of yore, that the world today is on the side of freedom and universal political equality. Okay, so a couple things here. Take up the sword. Okay, so now he's starting to shift into that direct call to action. Take up the sword. I think this is kind of an interesting phrase because, yes, while, swords were not unheard of at that point, it's not as though the battle would really be taking place, with huge armies of men swinging swords around. But by using that language, it kind of romanticizes the battle that he is encouraging his audience to join in. He says that we should trust in God who will defend the right. So there's this sense of confidence being built by saying that, divine goodness is on our side. He also says here that not only is God on our side, but he's starting to point out the political realities of the time. The world today is on the side of freedom and universal political equality. So this is a real confidence booster as well. Not only is God on our side, and that's a pretty good thing to have, but he's also saying, hey, the tides are starting to change. And for the audience, this is a real confidence booster. Okay, so we move on to the next little part. Let us recognize the war cry of the howling leaders of secession and treason is, let us drive back the advance guard of civil and religious freedom. Let us have more slave territory. Let us build stronger the tyrant system of slavery in the great American Republic. So here, he's kind of speaking from the perspective of what he calls the howling leaders of secession. So his choice of terms there is definitely intended to provoke hatred, outrage toward those leaders of the South. And then by, kind of putting words in their mouth here, he's further kind of like fueling this need for vengeance and stoking the anger of his audience. Okay, letting them see that these guys have no goal here beyond putting a boot on the neck of his people. Moving forward. Remember, too, that your very presence among the troops of the North would inspire your oppressed brethren of the South with zeal for the overthrow of the tyrant system and confidence in the army of the living God. Oop, see, there's that dachshund. Hang on a second. Let me deal with him. Okay, I think I've got the little doggy calmed down here. He tends to freak out when he hears literally any noise that's not me, so apologies for that. Okay, so I think we were kind of wrapping up here, just the last couple of sentences. So note that he's ending by saying, hey, not only is God on our side, not only is political will on our side and the rest of the world on our side, but by going down there, you are going to be directly helping your oppressed brethren. You're going to inspire them to want to take up arms as well and overthrow that tyrant system. So once again, he's using that term brethren here. And that's a powerful choice because, the free blacks of the North, well, they might not have any relation or connection to enslaved blacks in the South, but the word brethren here is building that sense of connection and reminding them, hey, we share a racial bond here, and we should be obligated to help out, much as we would help if they were our blood. And by labeling the system as a tyrant system, he's fueling once again their hatred and the sense that the fight is morally correct. And all of these moves together are making for a pretty powerful appeal and a pretty powerful argument to convince this audience of his fellow blacks to join Union forces. Okay, so I'll wrap up this video, and in the next one, I'll begin drafting and maybe even finishing a full rhetorical analysis essay. See you guys in the next one.